Guys, we made it. This is the last video for Global 9. So after this, you'll have an open notes test quiz kind of thing for next week. And certainly you'll have your little 10 question quiz for this. But after that, you guys are going to be done with Global 9 as long as you've been doing your work and you're, going on to 10th grade. But we'll get there. We'll get there. Hey, today we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is going to see some carryover from the scientific revolution that we talked about last time. But we're going to be way more focused on government and society. So less about science and the way that stuff works, and more about how systems work and how we can make them hopefully better. So we're going to be jumping right in just for the sake of time here. Our two big questions. Number one, we're going to meet a guy by the name of John Locke. So how did John Locke see the relationship between people and their government? And then secondly, what impact did the Enlightenment have on governments around the world? So that's our focus today, this idea of the Enlightenment. Let's jump right in. So the scientific revolution brings about this age of reason. And the age of reason is going to be really important because it's pushing back against this age of religion that we had seen previously. So again, people aren't doing things just because the Bible says so or just because the Pope says so. Now they want to know why. And that's part of the beauty of that whole scientific revolution. So we're going to start to call this period, especially once we get past the scientific revolution, we tend to call it the Enlightenment. And it's this period where people are using reason and individualism to guide new decisions. And here we're particularly talking about political and societal decisions. So by political, we're talking about government. By societal, we're talking about, how society works, just ordinary interactions between people. So again, reason and individualism, not necessarily like faith or traditions or the old way of doing things. And all of this very much comes out of the scientific approach to learning. So once we can start to really explore the world and ask those questions, this lets us ask questions not only about like planets and cells and things like that, but just how we live. How can we make that better? So education is going to really improve during this time. So does our understanding of the world, but also just the basic systems that we all encounter every day. Again, how do we make a good government? How do we make a good society that actually looks out for people? These are the kinds of questions that are going to be asked about in the Enlightenment. Now, there's a lot of different names that I'm going to throw at you. The most important, definitely, is this guy right here. This is John Locke. And John Locke was a very important thinker from England. He wrote a bunch of stuff. He lived from 1632 until 1704. So he's towards the end of the scientific revolution, the beginnings of this Enlightenment thing. He still exists before the United States certainly was on any map, but he's going to be, as we'll see, super important to the early history of the United States. So he argued a lot of different things. One of the things that he argued was that the idea of a parliament, where you've got a lot of people who are all coming together and making laws, is always going to be way better than a monarchy. And that was largely because of the stuff that he saw back home in England. In England, they had just had a pretty nasty civil war, which was kind of the king versus the parliament. Ultimately, the parliament won. It's called the English Civil War. And because the parliament won, that's part of the reason why, in today's UK and in Britain today, the British monarch has very little power, but the parliament has much more. So he says parliament's better than monarchy. And he also argued that people, just by virtue of being people, are born with certain rights. And as we'll see in just a second, if these rights are not being protected, then people, John Locke would argue, have the right to overthrow that government. So the government has a very specific job, and that's to protect three basic rights for people. If the government's not doing that, get rid of it. And we'll explain that more in a quote in just a second. But again, John Locke's ideas are super important when we're talking about the early United States. So when people like, up here we've got, looks like Tommy Jefferson and Madison and Ben Franklin, when they're all sitting down and they're talking about, what kind of country do we want this United States thing to be, and certainly how are we going to break away from Britain. They're going to pull up the ideas of John Locke and really use them to great effect, honestly. So this is a quote from one of Locke's writings. It's called Two Treatises on Civil Government. I just want to read you guys this clip because it's so important to understanding how John Locke sees this idea of government. So he says, in the state of nature, before governments existed, humans lacked protection. So just stopping right there. He says, once upon a time, we as humans, we didn't have governments. And because we didn't have a government, we lacked protection. There was nobody keeping us safe. So jumping right back in. So although governments once instituted, so once we created governments, they replaced individual action with the rule of law. They rest upon the consent of the governed. So what he's saying there is even once we got governments, which meant that we didn't have to protect ourselves, we had the rule of law. Governments still have this thing called the consent of the governed. They rest upon the consent of the governed. And that's going to be super important. We're going to define that in the next slide, so hang on 2 seconds. Now, the social contract, which is the agreement between fair government and responsible individuals, is not unconditional. If government oversteps its role in protecting life, liberty, and property of its citizens, the people have the right to abolish, which means destroy, and replace it. So there's a lot of big words here, but let's talk about the 4 most important points to really make this make sense. So we've got state of nature that he talks about. We've got this idea of consent of the governed. We've got social contract. And then we have this kind of scary right of revolution. So by state of nature, he's saying that once upon a time, people lived in a time before governments and before true society was actually established. And honestly, it was kind of scary. I mean, we don't always, but some people really like to talk about, well, it would be great if there was no government. I could do whatever I want. That's a terrible idea, and it never works out. It's never good for anybody. It's what we call anarchy, and anarchy is not fun, which is why we have governments in the first place. So because things were scary, there was nothing protecting us or our rights. That's why we create government, according to John Locke. Now that second piece that's there, consent of the governed. If you give your consent, it means you give your permission, right? So if governments rest upon the, as he says, the consent of the governed, that pretty much means that governments are only here because we give them permission to be here. And if we don't want them anymore, that's where things change. So the consent of the governed just means that, a created government is there because of the people who want it to be there. And people are powerful, John Locke would argue. They give governments the right to rule. Now, this agreement is called the social contract. Now, it's not a contract in the sense that like some people and some governments came together and they signed this thing out. It wasn't real. But it's important because the social contract is this very unofficial but still super key agreement between people and their government. Again, never happened. It's not an actual historical event. But what he says is there's this unspoken agreement between us and our government. We have to follow the laws, right? We have to obey the government. But in return, the government is there to protect our rights. Now, you may have noticed in that passage that was there, he talks about your 3 natural rights being your right to life, liberty, and property. Now, you probably remember that little list to be life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's because Thomas Jefferson didn't agree with that property piece. Because in the time that he was writing in the United States, or what would become the United States, women were not allowed to own property, and there were a lot of minority groups that were also not allowed to own property. So he kind of said, well, you can try and be happy, hence the whole pursuit of happiness thing. So, what those rights are is a little bit different. But John Locke says you have an agreement between your government. Your government will protect your life, liberty, and property, and in return, you will obey that government. Now, what happens if the government doesn't do that? If the government's not actually protecting your life, liberty, and property the way that it's supposed to, that's when we get to go to the last bullet, and that's what's called the right of revolution. Individuals, ordinary people, have the right to rebel against any government that might be abusing the social contract. Now, that doesn't mean like, no, I have to be taxed or whatever. That's not for like little things. This is a big deal. If you're going to break the social contract, that's a big deal. So if the government is bad, John Locke says we overthrow it. We rebel, we get rid of it. Now, has this ever happened in history? Yeah. This is the entire idea of the American Revolution. You think about the Britain was abusing its colonies, or at least they would argue that. And so what the young United States do? They rebelled. They kicked in their right of revolution in order to create a new country. So John Locke's ideas are super important in the history of the United States, but in the history of governments around the world. And it all comes out of this Enlightenment period. We're trying to figure out the rules of government. We're trying to figure out the rules of society and then make society and government better as a result. And that's what it's all about. Now, John Locke was not the only dude to think up all sorts of stuff during this time. We've also got this guy right here. Now, this guy is not English. He's French. His name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or you can just call him Rousseau. Again, he's French. He lives from 1712 until 1778, and he agreed with a lot of Locke's ideas, but he did want to clarify a couple little points. One of the things that he argued, and this is pretty key, is that all people are born naturally equal. So he says, when we're all born, we are all born naked and just with a whole lot of nothing. So we are all born 100% equal. And it's only because of this not so nice little thing called property that we have differences. Because as soon as one person says, well, this is mine, and then somebody else says, well, this is mine, and then we start to see these inequalities between people. So Rousseau had some pretty progressive ideas for his time that not everybody agreed with, but it's this idea of human equality. It's kind of important. One of the other things that he argued is that the government should always be controlled by what he called the desire of the majority or the general will, which means the government should be doing whatever it is that most people want. Now, how do you figure out what most people want? You vote. I mean, you get the sense of what everybody wants to make in terms of a political decision, and then that's what the government should go with. So Rousseau is going to also add some fuel to this whole fire. He's going to help out countries like the United States later on in terms of like figuring out what they want to be. And again, people like Rousseau are pretty darn important to this Enlightenment. But again, he's not the only one. There's also this guy. He is Baron de Montesquieu. Baron de Montesquieu is another important French thinker living about the same time as Rousseau, actually a little bit earlier. But one of the things that he argued is that we have to avoid absolutism. We can't have absolute government. We can't have one person doing all the different things that government is supposed to be. So how do you fix that? Well, you can separate the powers of government. And this is exactly what the United States will use in the creation of our own Constitution in the late 1700s. So he says, look, there's three basic jobs that government does. It enforces laws, it makes laws, and then it has to interpret or understand those laws. So what do? You split them up. You don't give them all to one person, because if the same person is enforcing, making, and interpreting laws, guess what? You've got a dictator, or at least an absolute monarch. And he says we have to avoid that. So how do we avoid it? We split it up between three different groups. So you have your executive branch, which again is going to be there to enforce the law. You're going to have your legislative branch, which is going to be there to make the laws, and then your judicial branch to interpret the laws. Now, every country does this differently. In the United States, obviously the head of the executive is the president, head of the legislative is the Congress, so the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then the head of the judicial would be the Supreme Court. Not every country does it that way. But again, you split the powers of government so that you don't have a dictator. And most countries would agree that's pretty darn important. And then lastly, we've got this guy. This is Voltaire. Voltaire is not his real name. It's his pen name. His real name was François-Marie Arouet, but, Voltaire is easier. So he's a French thinker. He's living at the same time as these other guys. He didn't have too many original things that he really came up with. But what's fun about Voltaire is he wrote a lot of plays and short stories that were meant to be silly. It was satire. So he would try and poke fun at the nobility and whoa, these guys, what do they do? He would poke fun at absolute governments, which of course is kind of dangerous, but he did it anyway. And he also poked fun at religion. Basically, he tried to argue against anything that might limit or abuse people. So, if it's something that's going to be hurting people or keeping them back from their full potential, he's going to make fun of it. Now, when I say he's making fun of it, again, he's writing stories, he's writing these plays and performing them. He's almost like a late night comedian. So if you guys or your parents or whatever ever watch like The Daily Show or John Oliver, a lot of these political shows that are kind of just making fun of what's going on in even Saturday Night Live, honestly, that's the kind of stuff that Voltaire did. He became very famous for just sort of like picking apart, why do we have such awful systems? Let's laugh about it, but then let's kind of try and fix it. Because one of the things he does do is he pushes pretty hard for this idea of social reform. How can we fix these things? Let's try and bring about changes that will bring a better quality of life for everyday people. So, how can we fix stuff? How can we build better systems so that everybody can take advantage of that? Not just the wealthy, not just the nobles or the church. Everybody can benefit from a government that's here. Um, Now, that being said, the government can make some changes to try and make people's lives better. But one of his most important points is that it was only people themselves. It was only us as a collective people that is really able to bring about the changes that we want to see. You can't always count on government. You can't always count on religion. Sometimes the people themselves have to just stand up and do what's right and what's important. And gosh, there's a lot of lessons in this particular lesson for today. But anyway, moving on. Now, hey, we mentioned we mentioned, excuse me, some of these absolute leaders, and some of them, certainly got angry at a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment. They totally got angry. They didn't like all of the stuff that people like Rousseau and Voltaire and John Locke and Montesquieu were talking about. But there were some that kind of listened, actually. And there were some of these European leaders at the time that, even though they were absolute leaders who could do whatever the heck they wanted, they also realized that part of keeping their power was in keeping their people happy. And as a result, they turned to a lot of these Enlightenment ideas. So we have this whole group of leaders that we call enlightened despots. And a despot is just another way of saying like a tyrant or a dictator. But these are enlightened despots. So these are absolute rulers that actually made the effort to try and improve the lives of their subjects. They actually said, you know what, yes, I'm big and scary and powerful, but I'm not just going to sit in my palace like Louis XIV. I'm actually going to try and do stuff for my people. So they start using some of these enlightened ideas to make themselves better rulers. Now, there's a whole slew of different enlightened despots. One is pretty famous, and that's the woman who's all the way up at the top there. Her name is Catherine the Great. She was the Tsarina, or the Empress of Russia, and she did a whole lot of stuff to improve the lives of her people. She tried to improve education. She also actually tried to give women a lot of new opportunities, which is very, very rare at this point in history, but she's a cool lady. The other guy who's right above there, is Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was another very important enlightened despot who did a lot of stuff for his country of Prussia, which at the time was sort of like a baby Germany. It has nothing to do with Russia, even though they're one letter apart. Weird. But Frederick the Great did a lot of stuff in terms of like trying to improve healthcare and infrastructure like roads and things like that. There's some little things that he did to try and actually improve LGBT rights, believe it or not. So he was actually kind of progressive for his time. Certainly during the 1700s, these were not the kinds of things that people thought about too much. So they're both considered to be very enlightened, very important, and very apt to listen to some of the things that these Enlightenment folks were trying to say. In fact, Frederick, again the guy on the bottom there of Prussia, baby Germany, hung out at Voltaire. In fact, Voltaire lived at his house for quite a while he was writing things, because certainly Voltaire's ideas about absolute monarchy they were not as well received in France, which was his home country. Now, as I've said a million times throughout the course of this, the Enlightenment is going to have some long-reaching effects on governments, because it really starts to get people thinking about, what's going to happen if we have a government that's actually for the people, instead of just a government that exists for the king or for the royal family or whatever. What if we have a government that's there to help the people out? So beginning in 1776, this is when these ideas are going to be put to the test, because we're going to have this crazy thing called the American Revolution, where the American colonies, the 13 colonies that Britain had over in North America, are going to try and break away from Great Britain. And they do. And it's crazy that they do, because they shouldn't have, but they got a lot of help from France and things like that. and they're able to stick to a lot of, particularly John Locke's ideas, but they'll hear out a lot of other Enlightenment thinkers as well. But they begin to argue, look, Britain is not protecting the colonists' rights, so let's break away, let's create our own country, and they do exactly that. Now, what you guys will look at probably at the beginning of next year is going to be what happens just a few years later in 1789, because in 1789, some of these Enlightenment principles are again going to come up during this thing called the French Revolution. Now, remember we talked about Louis XIV and how much power he was gathering at Versailles, but remember it was also at a cost. So the French people had spent years and years and years just under these brutal absolute monarchs. And so finally in 1789, much like the Americans over in the colonies, they say enough is enough. We have a government that is no longer protecting our rights. Let's rise up and let's overthrow it. And the French people are going to be able to overthrow one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Relatively easily. Now it's going to be a messy situation, and France is actually going to go in and out of quite a lot of turmoil for a while, but ultimately they too will be able to break away and create a new form of government that exists for the people. So again, these Enlightenment principles are where it's at. This is the future of government, the future of democracy, and they're incredibly important. And with that, gang, we are done with Global 9. That's all the global stuff. So you think about how far we've come this year. Remember, we started talking about the Neolithic Revolution, those early changes in humanity, the development of all these different civilizations, and now we're really starting to change the story and make it so that it's not just about these big important people. It's about the ordinary person. And how we live our lives. So history has just come a tremendous way. It's been a blast working with all of you guys, and I really hope that we get to catch up soon. But again, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, feel free to reach out to me. Good luck on those little quizzes, and good luck on your culminative test for next week. Just use your notes, you'll be fine. Wish everybody the best. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.